I'm Jeffrey, and this is AutoAlchemy, the intersection between typology and self-growth. Today, I'm going to compare everyone's favorite messiahs with literal advocates for the devil. Lego. So, I recently made a video where I talked about how to know whether or not you are an ENTP. And in the comment section of that video, one commenter wrote that he was having trouble determining if he was an ENTP or an INFJ. This video is intended to be a compare and contrast between those two types so that I can hopefully provide some clarity for the commenter in question or anybody else who's grappling with a similar question. Now, before we dive into it, I just want to acknowledge that I know some of you are out there saying, how could you possibly mistake these two types? INFJs are these radiant counselors, descended from heaven. They have halos hanging above their heads. And ENTPs, well, they're just assholes. They're Tony Stark wannabes. And believe me, I get why you might say that, but here at AutoAlchemy, we have to remember not to confuse the archetype with the architecture beneath. Because that previous line of questioning only makes sense if you're too attached to these highly cartoonish versions of what personality types look like. And as I've emphasized again and again on my channel, the same higher order behavior can originate from radically different cognitive building blocks. Okay, so for the remainder of this video, I'm going to be operating within the objective personality framework, but if you want a different perspective on INFJ, ENTP similarities and differences, I highly recommend you check out my collaboration with Harry from Cognitive Personality Theory. The link will be up here if I've done the conversion right in my brain. So let's start off by looking at the similarities between these two types. So the first thing that INFJs and ENTPs share is that they are both single observers, and in OP terms, what that essentially means is that they lead with either a sensing or intuitive function. So this would be roughly equivalent to the perceiving functions in MBTI land, and in Jung's original language, this would be the irrational functions. So a single observer is going to be relatively balanced between ego, persona, thinking, feelings, self, tribe, but they're going to be more inclined to get stuck on the observations, obviously. They're more likely to lose their shit about conspiracy theories, the Mandela effect, the paranormal, traffic jams, calendars, so on and so forth. A lot of stand-up comedy actually has an observery flavor. It's the whole, well, what's the deal with airline food, am I right? It's that particular attitude, but it's amplified and there's rarely anything funny about it. The second thing that these two types have in common is that they share a preference for intuition over sensing. And this means that they each will, in their own way, seek out the answers to life's difficulties in the realm of intuition and the realm of abstraction. They're going to be drawn to abstract concepts, metaphorical modes of being, philosophical frameworks, fictional universes of their own making, things that don't have a concrete, immediate existence. And by favoring this more abstract mode of being, they're naturally going to disregard sensory reality. They're going to see it as being secondary or irrelevant, and maybe at worst, an active antagonist preventing them from achieving their goals. And the final thing that these two types have in common is a shared deciding axis. Deciding functions are basically the same thing as the judging functions in MBTI and the rational functions in the original Jungian parlance. So ENTPs and INFJs both use introverted thinking and extroverted feeling, and they use these two things in a relatively balanced, even way. Meaning that the metaphorical seesaw of this particular axis will rarely lean too far in one direction. It usually quickly corrects itself. By the way, with these two functions, the existence of jumper types makes it even harder to tell the difference at times between certain ENTPs and certain INFJs. So with the similarities out of the way, we can now zero in on two crucial differences between these types. The first difference has to do with each type's relationship to chaos. In objective personality, this has something to do with your extroverted observer function, so that would be extroverted intuition or extroverted sensing. For types with NE or SE as a savior, chaos is kind of going to be their natural playground. They're going to have a fear of permanence, a fear of slowing down or being trapped in a particular box, whether that box is metaphorical or literal. They like to gather and accumulate. They seek variety in the form of new relationships or new concepts or new toys, new tools, new things to play with. And what they don't realize is that they sometimes end up looking like this. Now, the same couldn't be said for INFJs. INFJs have extroverted sensing as a daemon function, and worst of all, it's their fourth function. It's their inferior function. The INFJ typically fears sensory chaos and would like to tame that chaos by subordinating it to some sort of intuitive principle or formula or vision. Which brings me to the second big difference between these two types, their relationship to control. In objective personality, the idea of control is connected to your introverted observing function, so that would be SI, introverted sensing, or NI, introverted intuition. Types that have one of these functions as a savior tend to feel most at home whenever they are simplifying, narrowing, reducing, creating some sense of security. As I mentioned before, an INFJ might try to cope by meeting the chaotic happenings of life with a single intuitive formula that they just iterate again and again. When I think of the introverted observing functions, and NI in particular, one visual that really helps me is the idea of the tower in tarot. One interesting thing to consider is how having all of your eggs in one basket like this can sometimes create the very chaos that you're trying to avoid. Your lonely tower is struck by lightning, and then literally everything is on fire. Everything explodes into disarray. By the way, the opposite goes for ENTPs, who have introverted sensing as their major daemon function, and what this means is that at their most extreme, they're going to have control imposed on them from the outside. They eventually push one limit too many, and the world responds accordingly. Anyway, if you can figure out your personal relationship to chaos and control, then you're going to have more luck determining your type. However, if that's not enough, then you might have some luck using objective personality's animal coins and a little sexy probabilistic reasoning. I was really worried about making it through that word. So if you don't know, the animals work in the same way as cognitive functions. They come in pairs of opposites. There are the information animals, consume and blast, and the energy animals, play and sleep. Somebody who naturally prefers consume over blast is going to find it much easier to take in novel information for the sake of the self, but they're going to struggle with applying that information, getting started, somehow sharing it with the world. They tend to struggle with procrastinating, dragging their feet, failing to launch. Those who prefer blast over consume will be the opposite. They actually have no trouble sharing like it's nobody's business. But they're going to struggle at taking their talking points and taking their rules for action and updating those with new information. In this way, there's a danger of them coming across as an out-of-touch know-it-all. Now, somebody who prefers sleep above play is going to be addicted to the notion of preserving energy for the sake of the self at the expense of exerting energy to participate in the chaotic flux of human interaction. Because sleep is doubling up on the introverted functions, somebody who has sleep as a savior might struggle a bit with complacency or loneliness, isolation, with lacking human connection. On the other hand, those who prefer play above sleep, they don't have any trouble exerting that energy to connect with others, but the drawback is that they can lose sight of their own inner world and where their energetic boundaries are, and this can lead to burnout. So, how can these animals help us differentiate between INFJs and ENTPs? Well, if we put objective personality's sexual modalities aside, we see that there are 8 basic ENTPs and 8 basic INFJs. So let's say that you determine that consume is a savior animal for you while blast is a demon. As you can see here, 75% of the ENTPs are consumers while only 25% of INFJs are. Furthermore, you can see that the only INFJs that have a preference for consume will necessarily be lead sleep. So basically, no INFJ will ever have simultaneously play above sleep and consume above blast. With blast over consume, we have the opposite problem. 75% of INFJs are blasters, while only 25% of ENTPs are blasters, and the only ENTPs who prefer blast over consume also have lead play. So basically what you want to keep in mind is that no ENTP will ever be savior blast and save your sleep. And of course, we have the same thing happening with play and sleep. 75% of ENTPs prefer play as a savior, while only 25% of INFJs do. And you can flip those numbers for save your sleep. My point with all of this is that by locating and leveraging patterns like this, it can help you triangulate your type when you can't see other parts as clearly. As I said in my last video on this topic, sometimes figuring out your type can feel a lot like working with a Sudoku, and I hope that this particular video helped you to crack the case. And if not, please feel free to post some questions down below. So that's it. Thank you guys so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing. I will catch you guys in the next video. Adios.